legal reasoning assist in coming to a conclusion whether or not the resurrection occurred? Why is it that so many lawyers that have looked into this have become Christians?
If the evidence is evaluated by the same standards that apply in any legal case, the result is the conclusion that Jesus rose again from the dead. And since lawyers are experts in evidence and testimony, that means a great deal to them. Concretely, there was a book done some years ago, not by a lawyer, but by a man who was very much influenced by legal reasoning, Frank Morrison. The book is entitled, Who Moved the Stone? It's a classic of Christian apologetics. And in this book, Morrison reasons as a lawyer. He says, if Jesus didn't rise again from the dead, you're going to have to explain the missing body on Easter morning. The missing body. Now, bodies do not walk out of tombs unless there's a resurrection. So, if Jesus didn't rise again from the dead, someone must have taken it. There are only three interest groups in the situation: the Romans, the Jewish religious leaders, and the disciples. Would the Romans have stolen the body? Are you kidding? They are not in the provinces engaging in body snatching. They had no interest in doing so. To the contrary, they would have wanted, as Pilate did, to keep things quiet at all costs, and certainly leaving the body where it was would achieve that. The Jewish religious leaders were the very last people on the face of the globe to want to steal the body, because they were at a disadvantage if even a rumor got started that Jesus had risen again from the dead. Indeed, they went to the Romans, asked for a guard for the tomb so that no rumors would start about the resurrection. What about the disciples? Well, listen to this closely. If the disciples had stolen the body, they then would have gone out and died for something they knew to be untrue. Now, people die for things that are untrue. I mean, all the way through history, people have died for lame-brained religious ideas. But it's one thing to die for something you think is true and it isn't, and a very different thing to die for something you know very well is untrue. Eusebius, his ecclesiastical history in the 4th century, has one of his very few humorous paragraphs on the subject, in which he suggests that the disciples are sitting around after Easter and they say, well, of course, he didn't rise again from the dead and we took the body and all that, but let's go out and tell people that he rose again from the dead. Won't it be fun? Of course, we'll lose all our property, we'll lose our friends, and let's see, they crucified him. There's no telling what they're going to do to us, but it'll be fun. Let's go ahead and do it anyway. I mean, this is just psychologically out of the question.
Dr. Paul Kurtz was a guest on our program a couple months ago, and he's the man that wrote the Humanist Manifesto too. And when we got to this area, he said, but wait a minute, the only people that testified to the truth of the resurrection were all believers. And why didn't Jesus appear to any unbelievers? What would you say to that?
Well, as we indicated at one point earlier in this series, those disciples were not believers until the resurrection convinced them. Thus, Thomas was certainly an unbeliever. So there we are. But, you know, in a court of law, the question is not whether or not, is not how a person came to a particular conclusion. The concern in the court of law is whether or not his conclusion is upon the evidence. If Jesus rose again from the dead, it doesn't really make any difference who testifies to it. The important thing is simply that the person be in a position to have had direct contact with this man after he had come back from the dead. Yeah. And fascinatingly enough, you know, the way of demonstrating this doesn't require any great philosophical sophistication. All you've got to do is show that a person is dead at point A and alive again at point B. One good way to do this is offer them a fish. Very few people will eat fish if they're dead. Try it at the local funeral parlor. If that gray gentleman inside the door eats the fish, it's the undertaker, it's not the corpse. And Jesus ate fish with his disciples under controlled conditions after the resurrection. This is just one of the innumerable evidences over a 40-day period to the effect that this man was alive again. Professor Kurtz ought to pay attention to evidence like that.
Yeah, another way of saying it is we expressed to him that was like saying, listen, apart from the 10 witnesses who saw the murder on your side, all these 100 people over here, they didn't see it. Well, you only need one witness to convict a guy of murder in a trial.
Precisely.
Was there anybody that did see it? And are they credible? And we're saying that the evidence is in and they are credible. One other thing here, what have we found in archaeology that substantiates the fact that these men knew what they were writing about? That Luke, you got Ramsey, and you've got other people that started off as skeptics, and a lot of people don't know. There's been a lot of archaeological study that's been done here. Maybe give us one example before we go off the air here.
Well, it was said up until a generation ago that perhaps the New Testament writers had actually created Pontius Pilate. That such a person had never existed at all, because the only references to him in classical literature always relate him to the trial of Jesus. So perhaps he was a fig Newton of the apostles' imagination. But then, lo and behold, the archaeologists turn up the famed Pilate inscription. And there it states the name of Pilate and the fact that he is procurator there. This just goes to show that it's a very poor idea to be a liberal biblical critic, because you've got to change grounds every time someone sticks a spade in the ground.
Now, scholars have used different words to describe what they think the disciples saw. Some claim the disciples saw an ordinary appearance of Jesus. That is, Jesus was literally, physically present with them. He ate with them and invited them to touch him.
If there had been people there with tape recorders and cameras, they would have had photographic and audio images of Jesus appearing in the upper room. That would be an ordinary appearance.
So the fact is, one of those, if I remember correctly, and I'll just roll to it, the disciples had experiences which they believed were literal appearances of the risen Jesus.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, you're taking that in a naturalistic way, so give me your theory. How did that happen? I mean, something happened, is what everybody's saying.
Oh, yeah. My best suggestion is that these were grief-related visions. Apparently, these are fairly common. People who've lost a husband, wife, or close relative and are feeling distressed about it, suddenly have the feeling, I think, seem to see the familiar person around the house and so on.
Yeah.
I take it that these were grief-related visions, and there was nothing there that anybody else could have seen.
You just wrote a review for Jack Kent's book on the psychological origins of the resurrection myth, right? Yeah. And that's, I think, either out or coming out in Free Inquiry magazine and a couple others. In essence, he was saying that there's two reasons that he attributes for the experiences that these disciples had. Grief hallucination for the disciples, and conversion psychosis for Paul. You want to go with that?
I think, well, I don't know about conversion psychosis, but clearly it was the sort of thing that William James in Varieties of Religious Experience would be writing about. What happens in the cases of these rather spectacular religious conversions. Most people's conversions to or from a religion are much more slow-moving and so on, but there are a lot of these cases, many of which are found in that great work of William James.
Let me clarify why this is so important. 15 years ago, you two fellas had a wonderful debate. You know, most of us, we missed it. I got to read that in the book and so on, but it was a tremendous debate. But Jack Kent, the fellow that you are writing the review for, said that all dozen of the facts by Habermas that were presented by Habermas are great facts. The problem is Flew did not have a theory to explain those facts, and he lost the debate. Now, is this the theory that you want to go with?
Yes.
All right.
This is what I think I've learnt in the last 15 years. I hope I've learnt some other things besides that, but this is the relevant one.
My question's for Dr. Flew. Dr. Habermas, he's given quite an enormous amount of evidence for the resurrection. Do you have any evidence as far as books or claims of people in early centuries disputing the resurrection? And if not, then why not? And seeing as how the disciples were going around at the very same time saying he did resurrect.
The majority of the people in Jerusalem at the time didn't believe it. I mean, that's one of the great shortages of evidence, which I pointed out at the beginning. One of the reasons I think the whole thing is so difficult to be sure of. We do not have anything at all from the non-believers in Christianity. We don't have any explanation as to why they were not converted.
Well, it seems to me that Paul was a skeptic and was against it, and James was a skeptic and against it, and it seems like Thomas was a skeptic and against it, and they all got converted.
Yes, they did, but these are the people we have heard about. But there wasn't a great sweep in Judea. After all, there were a lot of opponents, there were the persecutors and so on. They were not persuaded. And again, if the earthquakes and so on that are recorded in the Gospels and the darkening of the sky and so on did occur, we need some explanation as to why people were not persuaded by these dramatic things.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that the non-Christian historical sources all mentioned that earthquake deal, didn't they, Gary?
Do they?
Yeah, Thales in about 52 AD and Phlegon a few decades later both mention the darkness. Phlegon mentions the earthquakes. And this is an example, I mean, I want to be kind to him, but this is an example of what I said earlier. When he gets real close to the evidence, he pulls away. The question was, what first century evidence do we not have? Why don't we have any first century evidence? And he said, well, that's a great question. We don't have any first century evidence. And I'm thinking, then how is this position established? If the Christian can be asked to give first century evidence, we've had 3 hours of testimony on first century evidence. The critic should be able to produce some first century evidence, but he said that's a big gap. There isn't any, but that's the problem. No. There isn't any.
Say, wait a minute. First century, the question is, we don't have any evidence about what the people in Jerusalem, at the date we don't know, it was clearly round about 30 AD. And why they didn't accept this.
But there is no contrary evidence to the resurrection, except for the lone report. The Jews said the disciples stole the body, which he doesn't hold. Yeah. But there's no first century data. See, what I'm saying is we could be asked, Christians could be asked to produce first century data. And by the way, Josephus not only records the disciples' belief that he was raised from the dead, so does Phlegon. The same guy that records the earthquake and the darkness says, Phlegon now, a freedman of Emperor Hadrian, says Jesus appeared to his disciples and showed him his wounds so he could be touched. That's a non-Christian source about the end of the first century, 70 years later.
And doesn't Tacitus, isn't he the one that documents this happened under Tiberius Caesar and Pilate?
How is this man at the end supposed to know that what was happening in Jerusalem at that time?
He wrote a book called Chronicles, and he was an ancient historian or chronicler, and he thought there was enough data to record that. But I mean, my point is, there's no contrary data. And since there's no contrary data, if we're talking history now, and not philosophical worldviews and biases, or not bias, the question is, what first century data is there?
What do you mean by contrary data here? It's alleged that someone rose from the dead. What contrary data could there be other than a direct investigation of that particular case?
That'd be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would be, but
you can't argue from the absence of evidence.
The other thing is, what would motivate people like Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus to put it in there?
But they didn't put in that, my goodness, a resurrection occurred there.
But Josephus does. The belief in it.
Ah, yes, and he says that people believed it, but that's a very different thing from producing evidence that it occurred.
Plus, Phlegon says he was raised and showed himself to his disciples. A freedman of Emperor Hadrian. He writes the Chronicles. He was born about 80 A.D.
Yeah,
so
and to argue that it didn't happen, but they put it in there anyway, would be saying that non-Christians are in on this conspiracy. In other words, what's the motivation for them to include it?
Well, the motivation will presumably be that they believed that this was said at the time. Or they
And why would they believe
believed.
it was said?
Well, they may have had some contacts with people who were there at the time.
Now, Tony, isn't that evidence? I mean, you take that for Tiberius Caesar. You said in the Craig debate that, you know, what we really need is something as strong as we have for Tiberius Caesar. We need something like that for Jesus Christ. We just don't have it. And I'm saying, what's different for Tiberius Caesar? Do you want to say that Tiberius Caesar didn't live, or Alexander the Great didn't live and do the things that he did? Because the data for Christ is actually better than Tiberius Caesar or for Alexander the Great.
Yeah, but the data about these chaps is not data about a miracle, is it?
But it's historical information that is better in the sense of recording what took place.
By the way, the Roman historians, he's right. On Tiberius Caesar, you've got 4 sources. On Jesus, you've got basically 4 major sources. An historian named Paterculus wrote about Tiberius, and he lived in his own lifetime. That's a great source. But the only problem is he wrote about Tiberius's military exploits, nothing about him being Caesar. All right, the next source for Tiberius is Tacitus, and it jumps 80 years. The next best one is Suetonius, jumps 90 years. And the 4th source for Tiberius is Dio Cassius, 212 AD, almost 200 years later. The best sources for Alexander are 3 to 4 centuries later. And yet we turn around and say, Mark's too far away at plus 40. Matthew and Luke are too far away at plus 50. John's too far away at plus 60. And we're not playing the same games, the rules of evidence here. And by the way, you say, well, they don't record miracles, but they do. They do. In Suetonius' account of Tiberius Caesar, he ends his chapter on Tiberius Caesar by talking about these miraculous prophecies and portents of coming things. And nobody shrinks back and says, he must be a loser and the history can't be history. But we do that stuff with Jesus. Now, I wonder why the rules aren't the same.
Now, didn't Tony's old professor on ancient history, Sherwin White, tell you about all of that, Tony?
No, not about all of it. The one thing he was producing some evidence about was something to do with Herod, wasn't it?
What did he say about this,
Well,
Gary?
when he and I were dialoguing in 1985, I was talking about Sherwin White, and in his excellent book, Roman Society and Roman Law in the New Testament, he was a specialist not only in Roman history, and a world-renowned specialist, but a specialist on Roman law. And that book, Roman Society, Roman Law in the New Testament, reads like F.F. Bruce or something. He's talking about all the points at which the New Testament's true. And I just brought this up in the debate to Tony in 85, and I said, what do you say about Sherwin White? And I was surprised when he said, far be it from me to disagree with my old Oxford tutor. And I had no idea that he'd studied under him at Oxford. So.
Now, why is it important to have this core of 12 facts that virtually all critical scholars, this is not evangelicals here, we're talking virtually all critical scholars out there. Let's drive this in. First of all, why do they accept this data?
Well, I think they accept it because it comes on good grounds. Today, Paul is widely accepted, as Tony has said. Virtually everything in the list can be established by Paul alone, and everybody thinks something can be gathered from the Gospels and Acts here and there. So I think it comes on good evidence. Now, why these 12? This is just something that I came up with in Historical Jesus. Others might have a list that's longer or shorter.
And if people question these, Gary, from what I understand in your book, is all of these 12, there's a ton of evidence that supports all of these from history. And we can get into that as well.
We could look at any one of them.
Now, Tony, you would agree that these 12 facts are accepted by the scholars?
Yeah.
All right. Now, the question is, we've got these facts. Now, what conclusion do we draw from them? Tony, what do you draw from this?
From this alone, leaving out Paul, nothing of any great interest. No.
I wanted to ask Professor Flew, this is the question for you. In the records that I've read in my Bible, it shows that there were many witnesses after the resurrection. And yet there were much less denials than there were believers of the resurrection. And I'm saying here, who was the person that said, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say unto them, I ascend unto my Father and my God and your God. I know this was Mary Magdalene, but the question is, who was talking? Was that Jesus talking to her, or do you think that was she was having a hallucination there?
Well, I don't believe there was anyone there, no.
You don't believe he was there?
No.
Why is it you don't believe he was there?
Because I regard this sort of thing as practically impossible.
For what reason?
Well, it's a matter of the whole development of natural science. And, of course, it's only because you think that this sort of thing is normally impossible that you think there was something remarkable about a particular case where you believed that it happened.
Let me ask you a question to follow up. Thank you very much. And that would be that, let's take Gary's illustration of the Walmart phenomenon, and let's say that one of your friends was just like that, and the friend did see you, and you did see the friend, and then your wife saw that friend, all right? Now, where does evidence come in versus your philosophical viewpoint? Would you then, I mean, how would you persuade a friend at school that holds the same view when you actually saw it? In other words, there wouldn't be any way then, would there?
Right. What am I supposed actually to have seen?
Let's say that you saw somebody come back from the dead. They
You
appeared at Walmart.
saw Buddy, and you have a lot of evidence that he's there, but you were at his funeral a week earlier. How much evidence would it take you to, you know, what would you do to deny your own senses if he were in front of you? If you were in Thomas's shoes.
Well, I must say I find it very difficult to answer this question. I mean, if you describe a situation which everyone here believes is altogether impossible, and then to ask me, what would I do if confronted by this? If I were to be confronted by this, I should have to think of an answer. But I cannot at the moment predict what I would do confronted by an absolutely ridiculous and impossible situation, which everyone knows to be ridiculous and impossible.
Let's go the other way. Let's say that it did happen. What I'm saying is, can you figure out a way to convince somebody like another Dr. Anthony Flew?
No.
When you saw it. So the fact is, you could actually have evidence, but you couldn't persuade that person.
I mean, what would you do if you were A.J. Ayer and had a near-death experience and believed in your mind that you stood before the being who was responsible for the whole universe? Well, see, he was in that situation.
Yes, I should wonder, really, why this sort of thing, as described by Ayer, should persuade me of such an extraordinary conclusion.
But if you thought you were there and stood in front of this light who was responsible for the universe, that might shake you up a little bit.
Well,
it apparently shook him up.
Well, yes, I'm very puzzled about this. Why this should lead Ayer to think he was confronting the maker of the universe, when what he actually says he experienced was some sort of patch of light. I mean, I find this, his reactions are simply unintelligible. I can't understand why a person like Ayer should believe that this experience was sufficient. I would have thought that if you're going to see the maker of the universe, you're going to see something a bit peculiar, you know, somehow dramatic and surprising. But what he says he's seen is the sort of thing that if most people had seen that sort of thing, they'd have said, I saw a coloured patch. You know, and why does someone seeing something utterly unexciting, utterly undramatic, say, oh, I thought I was confronted with the maker of the universe. My goodness, I've got to rethink my whole philosophical position. It seems to me this was a reason for thinking that he was getting a little crazy. It's such a grotesque, utterly inappropriate, utterly extraordinary reaction to what he says he saw.
Not only that, but the fact is, if you're going to use the account about Thomas, where I won't believe Okay, you have a skeptic there. I won't believe until I can put my hands right into the nail prints and see the side. Okay, whatever happened, you have his testimony after he said that, my Lord, my God. So something happened. What do you think?
Well, it is curious that Jesus is reported as saying not, so now you've touched, you believe, and so on. But he was saying that he'd seen. It's a very peculiar thing to my mind. It's not the way that I would have written a report if I'd been there and seen someone actually touching after the...
What about the women? In the two accounts, the women and Mary Magdalene alone, do you think they touched them?
These are accounts that they did. Yes, indeed. But that we have an account that they touched him is not a decisive reason to believe that he was touched. This is what they were reported as having done.
But you'd have more to complain about if no one touched him in the Gospels.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
At least we have these three cases because Ignatius says Thomas touched him.
It is remarkably little, actually. After all, we will all presumably remember, art thou not fatal vision, sensible to feeling as to sight? This is surely the first thing anyone would do if they were wondering whether the vision was a seeing of something that was there that other people could see and touch and so on.
By the way, if you're going to admit the data from the Gospels there, the same author of the fourth Gospel, 1 John, starts out the first 3 verses and says, we've seen him with our eyes, our hands have touched him, we've beheld the word that, in John 1:14, the word was made flesh. So John comes back in the first epistle, if you like, that material.
Let me read it to you here. 6 times he says, we have seen something. 6 times we have heard something. And he says, that which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, the Greek is scrutinized, and our hands have touched. So now Paul, Jesus, I think in Luke, wasn't it, where Jesus said, touch me and see that I'm not a ghost.
Right. Yes.
And eats.
Yeah. So the evidence seems to show that we have a literal physical body going on here that the boys were a little bit surprised to see in the first place, but it took them quite a few experiences, and they did touch, they did see, and that's what they're claiming.
It's not they didn't touch there, sure. They saw a vision of someone eating, didn't they?
Well, he says there, that which we touched.
Well, if you like, if you like the straightforward account, in Luke 24, Jesus said, a spirit hath not flesh and bones as ye see me have. So he's saying, I'm not a spirit, if we take the Gospels, straightforwardly.
Well, the Spirit is claiming not to be a spirit.
That since he's saying he's not a spirit, I assume that means he's not a spirit.
Gary, apply this. In other words, so far we've got an intellectual discussion here on the evidence, but I'm going to throw in the personal note, Tony, if you don't mind. Let's hear what Gary has to say. 95? Your wife, Debbie, that every one of your students that I've seen letters and heard about said that you guys had a love affair that was made in heaven. And yet she came down, 40-some years of age, with what?
Stomach cancer. Yeah, Tony was in my house in 1985, and just yesterday we were talking about this because he didn't know what had happened. But my wife passed away in the summer of 1995, 10 years after we met. 10 years after he was in the house, with stomach cancer. And, my first thought, you mentioned my skepticism earlier, I literally thought to myself, oh no, and here comes the doubts again. And they never came. But I had a graduate student who's now on our faculty who called me at the time and he said, where would you be right now if it weren't for the resurrection? And for me, Paul's point there about mourning, Christians mourn, but not as those without hope. It makes all the difference in the world whether you mourn with hope or without hope. We all despair when we lose a loved one, as this point about the disciples. But, to me, mourning my wife without the resurrection and mourning my wife with the resurrection makes all the difference in the world. So to me, the answer to my questions in 1995, when something like this, if this is a world in which God has raised Jesus from the dead, then if that's true in 30 AD, it's still true in 1995. and I could rest assured. I didn't know the answer. I don't know the answer to pain and suffering. I don't know anybody does, theist or atheist. We don't know the answers of pain and suffering. But with something like the resurrection, it made existential sense to me because it said something about her, where she was going.
Well,
where
spiritual, physical, what kind of way do you expect to see your wife then?
Right now, I think she's existing without a body, but I think we will be together and she will have a body, as I will.
So what happens when absent from the body is to be present with the Lord? What does that mean?
I think at the moment of death, before the Lord returns, believers are in the presence of the Lord without a physical body.
Okay.
I've got a friend, a philosopher, Buddy Peter Kreft at Boston College, who says, Plato was right as far as he went. He just didn't go far enough. Plato believed in disembodied state. What Plato did not believe in was a re-embodied state. And I think Orthodox Jews and Christians share that same hope.
Scholars want to know, what did these people really see? Did they see Jesus in his physical body, or in some kind of a vision?
Most scholars would certainly say the disciples believed that they saw Jesus. And many of them would just want to leave it there and say, okay, it was a subjective phenomena that happened here. But if you interpret those gospel documents about the resurrection appearances of the risen Lord, and you interpret the Pauline evidence and the rest of the New Testament evidence, they were claiming far more than that. They were claiming to actually have a physical encounter with Jesus after his death, that he ate, that he was tangible, could be touched, that he was still moving in space and time as a real person. So they were claiming more than just having had a vision of Jesus.